Hi, and welcome to the Power Hungry podcast, where we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. I'm Robert Bryce, and my guest today is my friend Avik Roy, the president of the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity. Avik, thanks for being with us today.
Robert, congrats on all the success you're having with this podcast. Excited to be on.
Well, I'm thrilled to have you on, and I'm going to just make the disclaimer right at the beginning. I'm rampant conflicts of interest here on this podcast. I joined FREOP, the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, a few months ago. Avik and I met several years ago, and he came to Austin, and we talked a few years ago about, and he invited me to join FREOP then. Well, I did finally, and I'm glad to.
It was a long courtship. You were like, the girl who, the pretty girl at the ball. I had to work on it.
Okay, well, we'll move past the courtship thing here and dive deeper into what FREOP is doing, because today really the focus is on politics and some on innovation. So Avik, I could give you a long introduction, but if you don't mind, I like to ask the guests to introduce themselves. So if you've just arrived at a dinner party, you don't know anyone there, what would you say?
Wow. Well, I don't know what I would say, honestly, but I am the president of the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, or freop.org, like you mentioned, which is a think tank that focuses on expanding economic opportunity to those who least have it. One key thing about us that makes us different from every other think tank that's out there is we really try hard to bring progressives and conservatives together. Our whole thing is achieving progressive policy outcomes using free enterprise, individual liberty, and technological innovation as the tools. You and I know, Robert, that free enterprises is the thing that's lifted people out of poverty all around the world. And our whole approach is to find ways to do that here in the United States and to bring Democrats and Republicans together on policies and ideas that can make a difference for the most people.
But to be clear, you come from the conservative side. You advised Rick Perry on his presidential campaign, Marco Rubio. So would you identify yourself as a Republican? How would you identify your own politics now?
I don't know, man. I mean, I don't know what the Republican Party stands for today. I know what I stand for, and it's what I described. So I look at it like, my what I try to do in this world of public policy is identify the things that bring us all together. I mean, when I was growing up, in the 70s and 80s, I took it for granted that all Americans agreed that what made America special was this idea of equal opportunity. That didn't matter where you came from, where your parents came from, what they made, where you lived. We all had an equal opportunity success, or something close to it, or at least that's what we aspired to. That's what we stood for as a country, and that's what I believe today. And I don't feel that's a particularly partisan point of view. And I would say that I'm a free market guy, and in that way, I align a lot with what Republicans have said they've stood for, but I wouldn't say Republicans have always lived up to the free enterprise credo. And on the Democratic side, while I may not always agree with the Democrats on every economic issue, I think at least today, I certainly find a lot to respect about the Democratic Party in terms of the efforts Democrats have made to rise above their recent past as the party of the Confederacy and be an inclusive party racially and otherwise. Well, I love that question, Robert, because just to step back a little bit, one thing about me is that I come from a scientific family. My dad was a molecular biologist. I myself majored in molecular biology at MIT before going to medical school. I'm someone who was steeped from birth, basically, to have a great belief in and admiration of the scientific method and empiricism. And what's so interesting about both the COVID debate and the climate debate is how much the word science is thrown around in ways that are actually not scientific. And there's this kind of, there's a degree to which in both the climate and energy debate and in the COVID debate, all you have to do is use the word science, and it's meant to be this kind of cloak of virtue. And there's much less attention paid to whether or not what you're doing is actually scientific, whether what you're doing is actually rigorously based on the evidence. What are the uncertainties? What are the things that are hard to measure? What are the things we don't know? And I find that incredibly interesting. And what's, at first, and particularly in the, say, March, April timeframe, think about the COVID debate, there was so much, there still is, but there was particularly then this real annoyance among some public health officials that they weren't getting as much deference as they felt they deserved for their pronouncements about COVID. And that was always so interesting because SARS-CoV-2 is a virus the world has never encountered before. That's why sometimes in news reports it's called the novel coronavirus. And the point about a novel virus is that its biology, its clinical effects, its virulence, its mutability are all things we don't know. Certainly didn't know then. We certainly had some inklings or some clues, but these are all things that we're starting to get to know better, starting to learn more about. But at the time, we were speculating about. And a lot of those speculations were wrong by the very elites who were demanding fealty to their points of view merely because they had PhDs or academic appointments. And that was a huge problem because, in particular, people who steeped in the public health paradigm of how to combat influenza pandemics. Influenza is a very different virus from SARS-CoV-2. And so what you might do to respond to an influenza pandemic is actually quite different in certain ways than what you would do to respond to coronavirus. So in all these ways, there were confident pronouncements that rapidly unraveled in terms of their accuracy. And as a result, the public health community does not have today the level of prestige or deference that it might otherwise have if there had been a much more careful and empirical approach to the knowledge that we actually had.
Well, I like that idea about the science as the cloak of virtue, right? Because that's been both sides. And I've heard it, to my ear, I've heard it more from the left about, well, we're trusting the science. Well, science is messy. I mean, it always is, right? And that was one of the things that one of my next points was just about the models, right? So I looked up in March, the Imperial College epidemiologist Neil Ferguson estimated that, or he published a paper. It said, even with social distancing, the U.S. could have 1 million deaths from the virus. And then a more recent one from, this is University of Washington, just in the last week or so, said predicted for the U.S. 225,000 COVID deaths by November. So I don't know, the idea of models and we've heard about them for a long time, but how accurate have the models been, and how much should we trust them?
Well, there's a lot to say about it. We could spend a whole hour talking about models,
sure,
because, and again, as you started with, this is relevant to the climate conversation as well. But to talk about COVID models, I listened to a really interesting interview recently that the 538 Nate Silver's site did with one of the guys at the University of Washington, which is where the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation is housed, that does one of these models. And they asked questions that were very intelligent, as you'd expect from people who understand what modeling is and what projections are and how to think about data. If you listen carefully to the interview that 538 did, it's really revealing if you know what to listen for. And what the questions they asked, what they teased out from this guy from the University of Washington was that the way they were modeling future COVID deaths was not by actually understanding anything about the virus, SARS-CoV-2, and how it spreads, but rather they were taking historical data from Wuhan and other places as to how many cases, how many deaths, et cetera, designing an equation to retroactively fit that curve. Now, that's one way to model things. It's an understandable way to think about modeling. But to imbue some sort of oracular power to a model that's basically built on taking a simplistic equation and mapping it onto a historical data set, that's not actually predictive of anything, because as we all know from investing, past performance is not a predictor of future results. Just because a curve has gone a certain way in the past does not have anything to do with how it will go in the future. And yet, that is the kind of epidemiological modeling that has held sway, and that's what created not only wildly inaccurate predictions of future death tolls, but also wild swings in the prediction. So one day IHME will predict there'll be 500,000 deaths. The next day they'll predict there's 50,000 deaths. And all that is being driven by the fact that as the real data comes in, they have to adjust their equation to retroactively fit that curve, and it spits out different numbers, that's not the right way to think about modeling. The right way to think about modeling is to say, okay, here is the virus. Here is how the virus is transmitted. Here is its general spread in certain communities. Here's how it affects people of different ages. Here's how it affects people in places where the population density is different, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Here are some of the policy restrictions that have come into play. And again, to give them some credit, they've tried to retroactively build some of those because they've been criticized for that. They've tried to build some of that into their model. But again, the public perception, particularly among journalists, is, well, these people have PhDs. They're using equations. Therefore, it must be true. And
right.
Just because you have an exponent next to a letter does not mean you're predicting something accurately.
So then, with the thing that underlies the models that are similar, it seems to me, and we discussed this when we were thinking about this interview, was underlying all of these projections and the models is the fear of the future, right? That catastrophe looms unless we do X and Y and Z, and the more extreme action we can take now, then the less fear we might have about the future. Am I reading the same way as you? How do you see it?
Well, there certainly is. I think a situation like this definitely reveals the spectrum of human nature in terms of people who are more risk averse and people who are more comfortable with risk. And this plays out on socioeconomic lines too. Because think about the construction worker who goes to work every day, wears a hard hat, has to take many precautions in order to protect himself from serious injury. Right? That's someone who understands risk, who understands what it means to take precautions, to go to work every day, knowing that danger is around. On the other hand, a journalist who spends all his time in front of a keyboard in an office building may not have the same assessment or understanding. The knowledge workers, people who work in the intellectual or information or creative economy, are people who temperamentally have maybe chosen those professions because of a certain orientation towards risk aversion, but at the very least, certainly don't experience that daily physical risk the way a lot of blue-collar or rural Americans might. And so that leads to a sorting or a bell curve or a binomial curve, you might say, in which there's a cluster of people who are more risk-oriented, who are comfortable with the possibility, however small, that they may get COVID. And they're willing to say, hey, let's reopen the schools. My kid has a 1 in 2 million chance of dying from COVID. I'm okay with that because he's actually got a bigger chance of getting hit by a car on the way to school than dying of COVID. I'm okay with that. And for others, no risk is too small to be scared of in this particular context. And one thing I think about in this regard, and it relates to how the COVID is being covered by the media, is the thing we used to talk about back in the day was car crashes versus plane crashes. So every time there's a plane crash, it's all over the news. And yet every time there's a car crash, it's not all over the news. And that has over time has led a lot of people to fear that planes are more dangerous than cars, even though statistically your chance of dying in a plane crash is far, far smaller than your chance of dying in a car crash.
Sure.
But so we see this in I've been listening to Mike Schellenberger's book on the way to work. The thing he talks about in that book is how the high profile nuclear accidents, like, okay, there's a tsunami that knocks over Fukushima And it's one of the few nuclear generators that's on an island that's susceptible to a tsunami, and they have some problems associated with that. And then all of a sudden, Germany decides they've got to shut down all their nuclear reactors, even though Germany's in the middle of Europe and is not at risk of being drowned in a tsunami, right? Like, this is the kind of thinking that goes on. And we've seen it in COVID as well, obviously, that there's a spectrum of views, spectrum of tolerance for risk.
So why is the U.S. doing so badly? I've looked at the mortality rates per 100,000, and I think we're the third worst, I think, is in overall. But or is that a fair characterization? Why is the U.S. doing badly?
We're not the third worst. We're among the advanced countries. I think we're I don't remember the exact number. We actually just published an updated analysis of this at freeop.org in our World Index of Healthcare Innovation Pandemic Performance Ranking. So you can look that up on our website. But the U.S. actually has done, it's not done great, but it's done better relative to other big European countries like the U.K., France, Spain, Italy. The one big European country that has done better than the U.S. is Germany. And part of that may be due to the fact, part of it may be just Germany being Germany and being a country where people follow rules and are willing to do things like trust the public health authorities. That could be. We've seen that to a large degree in the Nordic countries as well. But it could also be that Chinese tourists don't go to Frankfurt on holiday, but they do go to Spain, they do go to Italy, they do go to France. So we just don't know. And we've tried in our analysis to adjust for that fact, that tourism and economic integration, isolation is a factor. So people will point to New Zealand and say, well, New Zealand's doing great with the COVID. Well, New Zealand, it's pretty easy to shut your borders if you're New Zealand. You're not going to take a rowboat from Wuhan to New Zealand.
Right.
So,
not a lot of African migrants moving through New Zealand or people. Yeah, they can close their borders pretty easily. Yeah.
Yeah, so when you grade on a curve like that and try to think about all the different factors that are involved, of which some may be actually different strains of the virus. It may be that a more virulent strain of the virus swept through Europe to the east coast of the U.S. versus the one that came from Wuhan through the Pacific Rim to the west coast of the U.S. in December and January. So there's a lot we don't yet know. And in fact, if you look at all this in context, what I would say is our response has not been meaningfully better or worse than other countries. There are other countries whose stats are better, but it's unclear whether their stats are better because they've had a better pandemic response or because they've benefited from other structural factors. Basically, half the cases, half the deaths have taken place in the tri-state area around New York City. So if you were to basically split the U.S. into two countries, one is the way the New York City metropolitan area handled the crisis and the way the rest of America handled the crisis, you would come to a fairly different story. And that, I think, will continue to be true as we evolve here. Even though America is continuing to see cases and hospitalizations and deaths from COVID-19, we know a little bit more about how to handle hospitalizations. It's largely younger people who are getting infected now, and they are less susceptible to serious illness and death.
And isn't that, as I've watched your work and FreeOp's work on this, what I've heard is, or what your prescription for future dealing with this in the future is, we need to protect the vulnerable while allowing as much freedom as possible for the people who are less vulnerable. Is that a fair way to characterize what your position on it?
Yeah, this goes back to our early point about science and evidence, right? We have overwhelming evidence at this point that SARS-CoV-2 virus, the COVID-19 disease, is especially dangerous for people over the age of 65. And it's not that dangerous, though there are isolated cases that get a lot of play in the newspaper. It's not that dangerous for people under the age of 45. Only, I think, 1.8% of all COVID deaths in the United States have taken place in people under 35. Only 0.1 something percent have occurred in people under 25. So as you go down the age curve, it's pretty profound how much lower the risk is. It doesn't mean it's zero risk, but there is much lower risk. And so if we understand that, that leads us to do a couple of things. One, it would lead us to do a much better job than we have at protecting vulnerable seniors. 45% of all deaths from COVID-19 have taken place in nursing homes and assisted living facilities that house 0.6% of the US population. Think about that. 45% of the deaths have taken place in residential facilities housing 0.6% of the US population. Now, in any rational, scientific, evidence-based world, that would be the headline in every newspaper every single day. What are we doing to protect people in nursing homes? And yet it has been a total afterthought. In fact, at FreeOp, we obviously, as you know, Robert, we did the first nationwide analysis to add up these statistics because a lot of states weren't even reporting the data. They weren't even bothering to identify where people were dying from. We actually had to publish an incomplete data set with 37 states and basically shame the other states into reporting the data to get a full 50 days. We don't even still have a 50 state data set. We have a 49 state data set. But it took that long, months of work to get that out there. And then on the other hand, you have people who are saying, no, we should keep preschools and kindergartens closed, even though there is pretty compelling evidence, overwhelming evidence, I would argue at this point, that kids are in no danger from COVID-19 themselves, almost no danger, near zero danger, far more danger from the flu than from COVID-19. And most importantly, are not a risk for infecting their teachers or other school staff. So that is pretty compelling as well. And yet you have a lot of people saying, no, the schools have to stay closed. So there's just, the people out there brag and boast about how scientific they are. I urge them to live by that stated philosophy.
So a lot of work and the paper that I did for FreeUp on natural gas is ultimately about, a lot of your work is about class. And that was one of the reasons why I was attracted to FreeUp, right? About the class divide in America. How is the lockdown, or who is being hurt the most? What parts of society are being hurt most by the lockdown? You've testified before Congress on this very issue. And so who's being hurt most, and why is it important that we do this reopening, which has become a partisan issue? Why is it important for low and middle income people that we reopen as quickly as possible?
First, there absolutely is an economic divide between those who have the luxury of working from home and those who don't. Right? If you have the luxury of working from home, if you're in the knowledge sectors, it's pretty easy to camp out, relatively speaking. You're inconvenienced, but it's relatively easy. If your job requires being physically present in a workplace, you can't. And especially if your job involves something like obviously a hospitality-based industry or travel or hotel, restaurant, it's doubly hard, because not only does your job require to be there, but the business may not be there even if you show up. So there is a huge divide there, and you see it in, again, the comfort that journalists have relative to those who work in more blue-collar professions. So that's definitely one problem.
So can I interrupt for a second, because you've made several points here and digs, let's call it what it is, at the media and how the media has covered this. And is it because journalists in general don't work with their hands, that their knowledge, that they just assume everybody else should be able to stay at home too? I'm challenging you a little bit on that, because I've heard it, but I see where you're coming from. Is that fair, or are you? How do you see this?
Of course, I don't want to
divide here.
Yeah, like I don't want to paint with a broad brush in the sense it's not all journalists, right? Obviously, there are plenty of journalists who are doing a great job, working hard, covering the story, doing conscientious about their work, really concerned about the economic dislocation, et cetera. But I think we all have to be able to, we're talking a lot these days about white privilege, right? And maybe we're not talking enough about the privilege that comes from working in the information economy. And we need to be talking about that more. And journalism is very, very much a central part of the privilege that comes with working in the information economy.
That's well put. I like that. So how much of one of the other things that I've noticed, and you and I live here in Austin, but is the divide between rural America and urban America, just when it comes to the issue of wearing masks. I mean, just go a little ways outside of town and there's this divide, that people in rural areas like, well, that's what they do in the city. We're not worried about it here. But the question is this, how much of the spread of the virus is due to this kind of natural disinclination among Americans to distrust government, and that, well, I'm just not going to do that. Or even if a vaccine becomes available, well, I'm just not going to take it. Is that part of do you see that as a part of the reason why the virus has swelled, or is this just the natural progression of the virus, regardless of how we are as a people in terms of how we relate to government?
There's a degree of that, but I think it's been somewhat exaggerated. If you actually look at Europe in the early days of the pandemic, people in France weren't wearing masks. People in Italy weren't wearing masks. People in Spain were partying on the street. There, basically, all of Europe, most of Europe, I should say, not all, most of Europe did not take seriously the warnings from public health authorities, particularly in those big southern European countries, where they also, maybe in a different way than rural Americans, but they also have their healthy disregard for authority and rules and traffic lights and other things. And whereas in Asia, they reacted instantly. They snapped to because they understood the risks from that experience 17 years ago. And I think that's what's going to happen here is that the hardest hit parts of the country are more focused on masks because they've been hard hit. And the parts of the country that have not been hard hit, it's harder for them to, as you say, to relate this to the way. If you live in rural Texas, you have genuine reason to be frustrated that the mismanagement of the pandemic in New York City is being imposed on you, and that doesn't mean you should be in an enclosed space with 20 other people and not wear a mask if you live in a rural part of the country. But it does mean that we, those of us who live in cities, should be more understanding of their point of view, and try, instead of lecturing people about how irresponsible they are. I think we should come to it with a little bit more understanding and say, look, I get that. This may seem like it's not a real threat, that it's only something that happens in cities. But look at this rural area or that rural area where all it takes is one case. And because everyone goes to the same church, once there's one case, everyone else gets hit. And we don't want to be like that other small town over there.
Right.
And I think that's the way to try to bring it to people. And this whole just sort of lecturing tone that people take isn't going to work.
So back to the numbers, and we talked about, and FreeOp did that great work, early work on nursing homes, which the New York Times then quickly copied, I think. But are the numbers around the infections misleading? And that is that gets the headline. Well, this many new cases today, another record. Should we be focusing on that, or should it be on the mortality rate? What's the key number to be watching here?
Well, there's been an incredible negativity, a bias towards negativity and sensationalism of any negative-oriented figure in a lot of the coverage, particularly the headlines that have come out of the recent data sets. And what's important to understand is, and I tweeted about this a few weeks back, and it got a lot of circulation, that not all cases are the same. If you test positive for COVID-19, you're called a case. But if you test positive for COVID-19 and you're 25 years old, the likelihood that you're going to get hospitalized is very low. The likelihood that even if you do get hospitalized, that you die of COVID-19 is also very low. Whereas again, if you're 85 or 75 or 65, the risk is much higher. So not all cases are the same, and you really have to dig into the data of the people who are infected, who are testing positive, what's their age? Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be concerned about young people getting infected, because young people, even if they become a reservoir of the virus, can then go out and infect their elderly parents or their grandparents or their relatives in nursing homes or whoever it is. So you can't ignore it. It's important. But it's also important to understand the context of the numbers, which is to say, not all cases are the same, not all hospitalizations are the same, and not all deaths are the same. And by the way, one way to think about this optimistically, there's been a fair amount of controversy, not just in the U.S. but around the world, about how exactly to count COVID deaths. Different countries count them differently. In the U.S., the standard model is if you die in a motorcycle accident, but you tested positive for COVID a week before, you're counted as a COVID death, even though COVID was not clearly the cause of death. And that's why if you actually look at the footnotes of the CDC data, it says we're counting deaths with COVID, not deaths from COVID. Now, other countries do it differently. And because of that, the researchers who are trying to do international comparisons talk a lot about of how many people have died in a given week in June or May or April. And you compare that historical pattern to how many people are dying in 2020, what's that difference? Because that should take into account undercounted deaths and also overcounted deaths and get you somewhere that's approximately right.
Right. So you get more to an excess death number, which would be more accurate.
Yeah, it's at least particularly when you're comparing to other countries.
Sure.
It should at least align. So if countries are reporting the data in different ways, it should give you some sort of way of comparing countries internationally, even if their data sets are different.
Sure.
And by the way, if you look at those charts, if you look at those figures and look at excess deaths, right now, as of today, as we record this podcast, the excess deaths in the U.S. are 0 today, meaning like this week, the number of people dying for any reason is roughly the number of people who died last year and the year before that and the year before that. Now, that doesn't mean that we're free and clear from COVID, but it does suggest that what we're seeing now at this point is while some people may be dying of COVID, people aren't dying of other things, maybe because they're staying home or activity has been reduced or what have you. Maybe there are fewer car accidents because people aren't driving to work. Could be a lot of things. But it does give you some reason to be optimistic about where we are going into the tail end of the year. And by the way, if you look at those excess death statistics and compare the U.S. to other countries, the way it plays out right now is, if I recall correctly, as we record this, the most recent data set shows that the excess mortality in total in 2020 for the U.S. is about 23%. So 23% more people have died in 2020 than you would expect based on historical data. In countries like the UK, Belgium, Italy, it's more like 45% or higher. So that gives you a sense when I talk about comparing us to other countries. There may be we may turn out as the research gets done and we look backwards that we didn't do as badly as the perception is now. And by the way, I wouldn't be shocked if starting in mid-November the tone of coverage around COVID changes.
In that it wasn't that we didn't do, as you said, we didn't do that badly, or we did better than we thought we did, or is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it's just possible that there will be an emergence of research that puts the data in context more after the election is over.
I see, because so much of this is being seen through the partisan lens now.
A lot of it is. I mean, right. A lot of people want to be able to say
it's Trump's fault,
either genuinely or for partisan reasons want to be able to are mad about the way the U.S. has been handling this, or whether they want to blame Trump for that.
So let's talk about innovation for just a second. There's some news that there's positive developments on the vaccine front. Why is it so hard to develop a vaccine for this for this virus?
Well, vaccines are hard in general to develop. The fastest vaccine ever developed for a novel virus took 5 years. That was the Ebola virus. So it normally takes a long time to develop vaccines, and a big part of why is because not only do you have the standard challenges of research and development, but you have to manufacture the vaccine, which is itself a labor-intensive and time-consuming process. Then you have to put it in a bunch of people and then wait to see if they get infected. So you put the vaccine, say, in 10,000 people or 1,000 people. Obviously, you hope it's safe, too. You have to do those safety trials first. But then you have to just wait and see, okay, in 6 months or a year, how many of them got infected versus the people you didn't give the vaccine to. So generating the data, just logistically, it doesn't matter how smart you are, how talented you are, generating the data that validates that your vaccine actually works takes time, regardless of how smart you are. Now, there are some people out there who do think they're very smart and feel like they figured this one out. Um, and to your question about what makes developing a vaccine for this particular virus hard, it's that there can be a lot of mutations. So the part of the virus that most people are trying to develop a vaccine to is this protein on the surface of the virus called the spike protein, which is the protein on the surface of the coronavirus that then attaches to your acetylcholinesterase receptors, or ACE. Actually, sorry, not acetylcholinesterase, angiotensin converting enzyme receptors, which is ACE, acetylcholinesterase, something else, which are angiotensin converting enzyme is used to regulate blood pressure and a bunch of other cellular processes, and it's thought that the virus uses that receptor to attach and then get into your body. Now, the reason why the common cold, there's no cure for the common cold. The common cold is also a coronavirus, and the common cold mutates every year. It mutates even within a given year. And so you might develop immunity to the common cold, but you won't develop immunity necessarily to the next common cold that comes around. Having said that, it may be that one of the reasons why some people are immune to the coronavirus, the novel coronavirus, is because they have common cold antibodies lying around their system that are working against SARS-CoV-2. We just don't know. So there's a lot of wild cards, and before I started doing public policy work, I spent a dozen years as a biotechnology investor, and anyone who's invested in biotech can tell you that most things fail. And so those of us who invest in these companies are all aware that you often have promising data early on, but that promising data in early studies of 10 patients or 12 patients doesn't necessarily lead to something that works in 1,000 patients or 10,000 patients or 10 million patients, which is what we're talking about when it comes to a vaccine. And you have to be sure that there are no side effects, right? Because you're going to be putting this in tens of millions of people. So all that to say, there's a lot of risks ahead, a lot of wood to chop. And obviously we all hope that a virus succeeds. And I think that's part of what's driving the coverage of these vaccines. We all want an easy solution, and vaccines are appealing in that regard. But you also have to remember that there are a lot of investors in these companies who have an economic incentive, and the science we have to date is encouraging but very, very preliminary.
Good. So let's talk just about a couple of other things, and then we're coming on an hour here pretty soon, so I don't want to keep you all day. But let me ask this one about the climate change thing first, because we've been told on the climate change, and I'm picking on that because of the parallels that we're seeing with the COVID issue, but climate change has been sold, well, this is the existential threat. Well, we knew about the possibility of pandemics. But it seemed to me, if we look at it now and say, well, let's compare the two threats, the pandemic threat in terms of the effect on society has been far greater than the sometime threat, it seems to me, of climate change sometime in the future. How do you compare those two issues?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've seen people, I've seen takes on both sides of that, which is to say, I've seen people make the point that, hey, all this talk about climate change when we should have been concerned about a pandemic, which is a greater threat. And I've heard other people say, well, maybe the pandemic will help people realize what a threat climate change is, because people have been warning about pandemics being a disaster and no one listened to them. And now here we are. And now maybe that will show that people should be scared about disasters in general.
Let me go move on to the school issue and talk about that. So why is it important that we reopen schools sooner rather than later?
Well, this is a great example of something where the trade-off should be very clear, because we know very well, it's well established, both scientifically and economically, the damage that's caused to children, particularly younger children, but really all children who can't go to school. What that does to their educational attainment, what that does to the development of their brains, what that does to their economic outcomes. There's an enormous amount of research on this. This is something we understand, we know. And by the way, it's really, talk about equal opportunity and disparities. Rich people are going to be fine. What I'm hearing about from a lot of my New York City friends, by the way, is the schools are closed in New York City. So rich people are hiring the public school teachers to be personal tutors for their children. So, like, that's what's going to happen. The upper middle class and the wealthy will figure a way around this, either by providing their own enrichment for their children intellectually or by hiring tutors. And it's the poor kids who are going to suffer. And this is incredibly regressive policy. And again, the flip side of it as well, there's this, the worry is that teachers will get infected and be put at risk. And we have a lot of evidence, particularly from Europe, that that's not the case. The schools in Europe were open in the spring, and they're going to be open again in the fall. And this is not controversial. There are very few people in Europe who are saying, "Oh, it's really terrible that schools are reopening." This is understood as completely normal. One thing you hear now is a counter argument that's starting to burble up because, as you know, Robert, we just put out a big white paper on reopening schools at freeop.org. One of the things that's come up in response to that is some people saying, well, yes, it's true that Europe is reopening schools, but we have to ignore that because America's performance in the pandemic is so much worse than Europe's, which goes back to our earlier conversation about this very topic. Actually, no. Like, yes, there are some countries that are doing better than the U.S., like Germany, but other countries that are doing worse. Yet they're all opening schools and seeing no problem. So that doesn't mean we shouldn't take the spread of COVID-19 into account, particularly at the college level and maybe even at the high school level. If there are local communities that are really having a major outbreak, that's something to be mindful of for those older children and younger adults. The risk of adult-to-adult transmission is higher, so teachers should wear masks. They should engage in physical distancing. They should take their classes outdoors if they can. Lots of things that the teachers should do to protect themselves from other teachers and other staff. They don't have to be worried that a 5-year-old is going to infect them with COVID, which is, again, I understand the intuition, right? Those of us who've had young children, we all understand that when it comes to other things like the common cold or the flu, we get bugs from our kids all the time. And so there's an understandable worry that COVID is going to be like that. Well, if we all get bugs from our kids when they go to school in a normal year, shouldn't that be the case with COVID? And this is where, again, the science is really important. And those who like to talk about science and mention the word science in every sentence should be the ones who have the most responsibility to talk about the evidence dispassionately.
So when I was talking with a friend of mine about this issue and about, I had this question. I said, well, I want to ask this question. What is the danger of not reopening? And his reply was, well, that's a Republican question, right? But it just seemed to me that it goes back to what we've been talking about around this whole issue is this partisan divide over the science and what's considered good science and what's considered partisan. So we've talked around this, but I want to ask this question directly. Why is the partisan divide over the policy so extreme? And we've seen something similar in climate issues, but why about COVID? Why is this become such a partisan issue?
Well, Emily Eakins, who's a member of FreeOp's board of advisors and a pollster, particularly of millennials, has done some really good polling about this, where she shows that there is a partisan discrepancy on the subject of risk aversion versus risk orientation, that people who identify as conservative politically or Republican politically are more risk oriented, and those who identify with Democratic Party or more progressive have more risk aversion. And you see this in some of Jonathan Haidt's work too, about interest in avoiding harm as being particularly important to people on the left side of the spectrum. So there is some partisan sorting or ideological sorting that occurs. But I'd like to take your question, Robert, in a different direction,
Sure.
Which is to say that I really am disappointed by the dynamic in which Democrats or people on the progressive side think of themselves as the party of science, and Republican voters or conservatives who bristle at being talked down to by the PhDs in the ivory towers respond to that being talked down to by saying they're just going to ignore science or we're going to be anti-scientific. In a sense, they're kind of being goaded into an anti-scientific position. When in fact, all parties, Republicans, Democrats, conservatives, progressives, centrists should all be evidence driven. And if you're a true conservative, you should be a conservative because the policies that you support empirically will make people better off than the policies you oppose. And in fact, there's quite a bit of science, quite a bit of evidence to support that view. And there are a lot of free market economic thinkers. Friedrich Hayek, in particular, comes to mind, who understood this problem very well. Friedrich Hayek won the Nobel Prize for his theory of knowledge, or his concern about the knowledge problem, that central planning doesn't work because central planners don't get accurate information about how the economy is performing because there's no price signal. This was his contribution to economic thought. So understanding knowledge and evidence and science and empiricism should be central to a well-functioning conservative movement.
You said, and there was an article that was published about you in the Atlantic, and you said, my goal is to persuade those who disagree with me that we ought to reorient the conservative movement to embrace the diversity of America. And we talked around this a little bit about the right and the right-left divide. And I think we've seen a lot of this under Trump, that there's been some rejection on the conservative side of this diversity. So that's a big goal that you've set. How do you go about accomplishing that?
I think it was Margaret Mead who once said that never doubt that a small group of people can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. And that's how I think about what we're doing at Free Out. Is yes, it's true that we're tackling big problems. We're tackling problems like how to solve the debt and deficit crisis of America, the affordability of healthcare, the climate challenges and affordability of energy, the stuff that you're doing that's incredibly important, the affordability of housing, improving education, student debt, criminal justice reform. We're taking on the biggest problems that affect tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of Americans. And you could say, well, that's pretty ambitious for a small group of people. But history shows that it is small groups of people who've achieved that change over time by having an approach that works and having ideas that solve problems in original ways. So on this particular topic of how to make the conservative movement more inclusive, it really it requires us to think anew about what conservatism is trying to conserve. And I think that's been a challenge. It's a challenge for conservative movements all around the world. But it's true in the United States, where the conservative movement of 1955 would be saying, well, we're trying to conserve maybe the Anglo-American tradition. And the Anglo-American tradition has a lot to conserve or commend to it, but it's not the only tradition out there that's in America today. And the idea that stated or unstated, somehow you're not an equal partner in the American project if that's not your tradition, is problematic on many levels. And it's particularly problematic because it's not actually true. The reason people come here, to go back to what we started with, is because America's a place where anybody can succeed regardless of their ancestry. That's what makes America exceptional. America is not exceptional because of our tax rate. America is not exceptional because there is a legislative branch and an executive branch and a judicial branch. What makes America exceptional is that it's a country where people from all over the world have come here with nothing and made something amazing out of their lives. That's what makes America exceptional. And so how to bring that back to the conservative movement, you have to have a conservative. And again, I don't know if the conservative is even the right term to describe what I'm describing. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's liberal. Maybe what people like you and me need to do, Robert, is reclaim the word liberal, where people have the freedom to pursue their own path in life, and they're economically free to pursue their own path in life. But we really try hard to give everybody a fair chance of success. Maybe what that is not conservatism at all, but liberalism, and let the progressives have a different economic agenda for what they describe. as progressive versus
it's interesting
how
as you
we
say.
describe progress.
Sure. Well, it's interesting as you say that, because as I look at you, and we've known each other a while, but you're first generation American. Your folks immigrated here, and that you're kind of an example of this exceptionalism that you're talking about, aren't you?
I missed, you said first generation, your parents
I'll
immigrated here, then I lost it.
I'll restate it. So, I think you said that really beautifully, honestly, that this idea about American exceptionalism is this opportunity, right? But your own history, your own family's history, your mother, who was, as I remember you said, identifies as a Democrat because she didn't feel like the Republicans accepted that diversity. But you're a living example of this, right? Son of immigrant parents, you went to MIT, you went to Yale. I mean, you're kind of an example of this, aren't you?
Yeah, well, just to flesh out the story on my mom, I mean, the thing about her that made her a Democrat was, even though she is a conservative in every aspect of her life, the fundamental thing is that my mom is a devout Hindu. And she not merely perceives, but knows that the Republican Party does not see Hindus as equal partners in America. Like, there will not be, at least in the next several years, a Republican member of Congress who's Hindu, or leading Republican politician who's Hindu. The Indian American politicians who've been successful at the national level in the U.S. on the Republican side are Indians who converted to Christianity. Now, nothing wrong with that. I myself am a Christian convert, but you can understand, to someone who's a devout Hindu, that they look at that as the Republican Party and say, you know what, that's not for me. And so that's, it's not just about race. It's about, you'll hear a lot of conservatives say, well, what we are about is the Judeo-Christian tradition. And again, the Judeo-Christian tradition is wonderful, has a lot to commend to it, but a party that that self-identifies as being solely about the Judeo-Christian tradition is one that is inherently going to be exclusive to people who do not see themselves as part of that tradition, or believers, religious believers. And
Sure.
Some people might say, fine, good riddance. I don't, because I think there are a lot of people who share my values, share the values of my mom, who just come from a different background, and that should be okay. And the conservative movement in America, to the degree that it's worth saving, and maybe it's not, but if it wants to save itself, if it wants to be representative or reflective of the majority of the country again, it's going to have to find a way to be much more inclusive.
Sure. Yeah, agreed. Well, so last two things. So, what are you reading these days? What books are you reading? What's on your nightstand? What's on your desk, your bookshelf that you're reading now? What captures your attention these days?
You mean other than A Question of Power by Robert Bryce?
Well, other than that, I know that's on the top of and rightfully so, on the top of the list. But besides that.
Well, I've been reading a lot of interesting books lately. I'll go through some of the ones I've read recently, and then the ones that are on deck, which is always subject to change, of course, if something comes out that's interesting. The couple of books that I've read recently and gotten through. One is The Great Influenza, the John Barry history of the 1918 influenza pandemic, which is, only read it if you're a glutton for punishment, because it is really tough reading. It's a lot of, sordid tales of dead bodies. Basically, he's trying to explain to you in an environment before COVID-19 what it's like to live through a pandemic. So it's not the most pleasant reading, right, but it is very interesting to think about the lessons from 1918 and how they apply to today. I also read a great book by my friend Ezra Klein called We'Re Polarized, which is about the roots of the political polarization that we're dealing with now, something that we talked about on the show. And in particular, what's interesting about that book is, and Ezra sort of touches on this, he doesn't as clearly articulate this as I'm about to, but we've always been polarized. The difference is we used to be polarized along maybe north-south lines or white-black lines. Now we're polarized among urban-rural lines, more regional lines, and partisan lines. Right, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party are much more not so much necessarily even ideologically sorted, but very culturally and temperamentally sorted in ways that are mutually reinforcing. And that's aided and abetted by various things about the modern media ecosystem and society. So that was an interesting book to
Yeah,
read and
and
think
I'll just
about.
add to that quickly because I think this geographic divide is one of the ones that, I mean, I've written about it a lot. I do a lot of interviews with small town politicians, rural landowners, and it is a profound disconnect between
Yeah.
rural America and urban America, and it's one that I think is growing, and it's going to change a lot of these energy plans that are being talked about now because a lot of rural America just won't have it. They just won't put up with it.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And then after I finished Mike Schellenberger's book, Apocalypse Never, the two that are on deck for me right now are a book that I'm a third of the way through by Elizabeth Rosenthal called An American Sickness, which is a really well written, compelling book. She's a New York Times writer. A compelling book about the struggles that Americans have with the complex and costly healthcare system, how drug companies, medical device companies, your local doctor, uh, the hospital system in your area, all extract and exploit the complexity of the healthcare system to enrich themselves at your expense. And that may seem like a very populist way of describing it, but the healthcare system makes you more of a populist once you realize how rigged the system is against ordinary people. And then the other book that I haven't started, but I'm really eager to read, is the new biography of Frederick Douglass, who's a guy who I think we all can learn a lot from. And I'm
Who wrote it? Who's the author?
This is embarrassing that I don't have in front of me, and because I quit Safari to make our internet connection. I'll look it up right now because I'll pull up Audible on my phone, and I will find it. And it is who is it? Where is it? It's by David Blight, and the subtitle is. Oops! Now I'm just about to play it on my phone. I don't want to do that. But it's basically this new biography of Frederick Douglass that a number of my friends have recommended to me. That's super compelling and also super long. So it's the kind of book you want to read if you've got a long quarantine ahead of you.
which we may still have. So last question, what makes you hopeful, Avik? We've talked about a lot of things that are difficult, and the lockdown has been difficult, and it's taken a toll on all of us. I mean, I hear in my own family about just, oh God, can't we just go out to dinner? And but what amidst all of these things, what as you look forward, what makes you hopeful for the future?
Well, that's a great question, and I'll recommend, by the way, another member of our board of advisors, Zach Carabell, has a podcast on this topic of what are the things about modern society that should, or technological innovation that should make us more optimistic. I think it's called "What's Going Right." So I recommend that for podcasters out there. Look, the irony of the world of today is actually, in many ways, it's better than it's ever been. Right? We are freer to pursue our passions in wealthy countries like ours than we've ever been. The fact that you're doing this podcast and writing and thinking and doing whatever you want, making a living doing it, that's pretty cool. That very few people have the ability to do that 40 years ago. And obviously not everybody has the ability to do that today. But the point is, there's a lot more opportunity to pursue your dreams today in a way that wasn't true and that we failed to appreciate. But and sometimes the irony of material prosperity is we become less happy because we don't realize how good we have it. And I think that's probably the place to start, is to say, the essence of life, in a sense. I have 3 rules of happiness. Actually, I'll put it to you this way, Robert. I have 3 rules of happiness.
Lay them on me.
I believe that they're as profound as Newton's 3 laws of mechanics, though no buildings have been named after me as a result of my profundity. But here they are. The first is never be afraid to look stupid. Think of the things that we don't do, or the people we don't approach, or the things we don't try because we're afraid of failing and falling flat on our face and looking stupid. If you're never afraid to look stupid and you're okay with that failure and that humility or that humiliation, there's an enormous amount you can achieve in life and be happy and a richness to your life that you'll have. And I think we live in a world that's culturally increasingly moving in that direction where people are willing to try new things. The second is never say no to a unique experience that's obviously not self-destructive. And I was saying go out there and snort cocaine, but if you have the opportunity to do something unique in a way that's not obviously destructive to you or irresponsible, you should do it. And if you do that, you're going to find that you never have that regret of, oh gosh, I should have taken that interview, or I should have taken that trip, or I should have asked that girl or guy out, or whatever it is. And then the third is, and this is the one that really relates to the theme, there's nothing in this life that you deserve. I think too often we are angry or upset or unhappy because of the things we feel like we deserve that we don't have. Like right now, a lot of us are frustrated because of the constraints on our lives as we endure this pandemic. But in other parts of the world, disease, illness, death, injury are an everyday occurrence. Imagine what it's like to be born in Syria right now, especially if you're a member of an ethnic or religious minority. Your life is a hell of a lot better in the United States, regardless of your income, than it is if you're growing up in that environment. And so no matter how tragic our individual situation is, and for most of us, it's not actually that tragic. Some of us, it genuinely is. We have a lot to be thankful for. And if we take that as our approach and we then look around the world and see how much we have to be thankful for, actually we have quite a bit.
Yeah. I like that. That's good. That's a great. I'd boil it down. Well, I don't know some study. These are so you give me your three, my two: gratitude and forgiveness. So those are mine.
There you go.
But I'm hopeful as well, and I like just getting a hopeful view for the future. So that's great. So Avik, thanks a million for being on the Power Hungry podcast. Thanks to all of you people out there in podcast land who are listening. If you like this podcast, go to ratethispodcast.com/Power Hungry and give it 6, 12, 14 stars. I think you can give 5, but if you want to give more, by all means. Again, thanks to Avik, the president of FREOP, the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, freop.org, FREOPP.org. You can tune in there. Thanks again for listening. This has been the Power Hungry podcast. Tune in next week. We will have a new episode then. All right. Thanks again, y'all.